Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. I wanted to talk about two essential liberal values, and they're actually on the poster behind me. Freedom of belief, or really freedom of thought, and freedom of expression. And I'd like to start by just referring to the Freethinker magazine, which has always, or has historically been, the magazine of secularism since its foundation in 1881. Because I think the tradition of free thought in Britain is very closely related to the history of secularism and can tell us a lot about what liberal values mean today and what we think is important. The Freethinker was founded as a magazine for secularists in 1881 in the heat of the struggle by Charles Bradlaugh to enter Parliament. Although he was elected in 1880, he wasn't actually able to take his seat until 1886 because the religious and political establishment strongly disliked the fact that he was an atheist and a Republican. Charles Bradlaugh, the first president of the National Secular Society, embodied secularism and free thought in the 1880s in particular and in the second half of the 19th century. He was known as the bellowing blasphemer, and he was always the bugbear of the establishment. He was in many ways a paradigm case of a freethinker, of someone who thinks independently for themselves, in a long tradition of British free thought, both political and intellectual, which earlier in the century had included Thomas Paine, but goes right back to free-thinking religious radicals such as John Milton. And I think looking at the tradition of free thought in Britain, it starts with resistance to religion, because religion is the form of authority, the form of dogma at the beginning. But I think what I would like to say is that today, when we're thinking of what free thought and secularism are, we have to think the opposition, the authority, the dogma is wider than just religious dogma. The Freethinker was founded in defiance of the political and religious establishment, and only 2 years after its foundation in 1883, its first editor, George W. Foote, was imprisoned for blasphemy for a whole year for publishing various things critical of religion, including blasphemous cartoons. Clearly, cartoons have a long history of giving offense, yet shouldn't they fall under free expression? Perhaps. While Bradlaugh, Foote, and their supporters carried on the struggle against the religious and political establishment from a perspective of outsiders from being working class or lower middle class, and definitely always at the same time struggling financially for their existence, J.S. Mill, in contrast to, I think, is one of the other really key figures of liberalism who we need to look to for liberal values, was extremely well connected in philosophical and liberal circles. In addition to being one of the most eminent philosophers of the age, he was also at various times a colonial administrator for the East India Company, the rector of St Andrews University, and a Liberal MP. His On Liberty, published in 1859, which was the same year as The Origin of the Species, is and must remain a central text of liberalism, and a text which states as the paradigm expression of the vital importance of civil liberties in the British tradition. For liberal secularists. It particularly, On Liberty, makes a case for the importance of freedom of expression and thought. As Mill says, these two freedoms are practically inseparable. As he said in another speech, if you want to know whether you are thinking rightly, put your thought into words. They're two sides of the same coin. Mill also criticized a society in which would allow for the deep slumber of a decided opinion. Opinions only remain vital, he said, by being constantly subject to criticism. They involve challenging the received morality of the day, I think is very important. And they also involve intellectual humility. Mill criticized the idea that those with power might assume infallibility. They might say that their views are so right that it is disgraceful even to think about challenging them. J.S. Mill was godfather to Bertrand Russell, another preeminent British philosopher, humanist and secularist, whose own ideas about free thought were shaped in part by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And in 1944, at a time when liberal values were really under challenge, Bertrand Russell published a little essay called The Value of Free Thought, How to Become a Truth Seeker and Break the Chains of Mental Slavery. And in this, he argued that in order to think freely, the individual has to be free of two things in particular: free from your own passions and free also from the tyranny of tradition. And by tradition, we can think of convention, we can think of any political biases, and we can think of even the tyranny of the culture in which you're brought up. Everything has to be questioned. In the third decade of the 21st century, I think we can look back at the experience of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century and also some new challenges of our own when trying to restate the importance of free thought and free speech as liberal values. In particular, I would suggest that the rules of the game have to be better defined, and I think this is something that secularism in a liberal society has to rest on. Free thought and free speech are only powerful liberal values if they can challenge authoritarianism and dogma using the weapons of freethinkers through the ages from Socrates onwards. These weapons include learned uncertainty, liberating doubt, the idea that you may not be right, reason, logic, empirical evidence, and all the scholarly methods of the sciences or humanities. In other words, as far as possible, you have to try and come to an agreement about the rules by which you're playing. If you can't come to an agreement about the rules, then we can't make progress as a society in terms of agreeing about legislation or policy. As editor of the Freethinker, I stipulated in my guidelines for submissions that they should be written not to advocate a particular viewpoint, but simply with intelligence and clarity. I also wanted to discourage punditry, pontification, and rants, in other words, dogma. And I think that it's actually important always to think about the methods by which we come to our views. And I think this is one way in which we can answer the question of how can we as a society discuss and disagree without simply shouting at each other. The second thing I wanted to very quickly touch on was what is secularism opposed to today? Well, secularism is opposed to religious dogma, but also it can arguably be opposed to any religious-like dogma. One person who's talked about this is Helen Pluckrose, for example, who's argued that secularism should mean the separation of the state from any religion-like ideology, such as, for example, critical social justice theory. Anything which is imposed on the basis of authority, on the basis of assertion of people, without allowing challenge, dismissing challenge in advance. In a truly liberal society, the starting point should surely be that civil liberties or human rights of all kinds, including above all liberty of thought and expression, are precious and should be jealously guarded. Before these liberties are ever yielded up to the authorities, public debate, thorough public debate should be had according to the same rules of the game about the consequences of what those policies might be. And I think the assisted dying debate is a particularly important example of this, which I think Lord Scribbett may talk about. To conclude, liberal secularism is or should be inherently anti-authoritarian and anti-dogmatic. It should view with suspicion all attempts to impose an ideology or set of political demands on other people against their will without questioning, because such imposition is likely to undermine freedom of thought and speech and other liberal values. Thank you.